All right, let's see here. All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us again for another episode of The Ken Show. My name is Corey DeVos. I'm the editor-in-chief here at integrallife.com. And with me, as always, is the one and only Ken Wilber. Ken, how you doing today, man?
Good, buddy.
Good. Today is, as usual, going to be a really fun episode. I thought what we would do this month, Ken, is, we spent the last several months basically taking, some in-depth looks at integral political theory, which we covered in the episode called The Major and Minor Scales of Integral Politics. And we spent a lot of time also talking about sort of our current integral political culture, notably in episodes like The Baby in the Bathwater, Saving Liberalism, but really in all the episodes that we covered so far. And we've had some really, really great conversation. I think we're up to something like 22 hours of just amazing conversation. But I thought maybe what we would do this time around is actually try to drill down even further and start talking, on the level of actual policies. So what I did today is we've gathered together a number of controversial issues that really I think are just aching for a more integral view and a more integral approach. I should say that a lot of these questions, a lot of these issues were actually generated from the Integral Life community, which if you guys haven't checked it out, you should. Just go to integrallife.com. There's a community link at the top of the screen. Come by, say hi. We'd love to see some more activity in there. So yeah, come and check it out. And before we start, Ken, I just want to make a couple notes here. To our audience, I think it's probably important that we're clear that the purpose of this episode in particular is to ask Ken for his view on some really, really complex issues. And by doing this, by Ken offering his view, this is not suggesting that, Ken's view is the only right or wrong approach to, we're, again, very, very difficult issues here. Our view of the world is really based upon how we make sense of all of the data that's available to us. And that is actually determined by our cosmic address. So our various, levels and lines and just where we are in the growing up, waking up, and really cleaning up process is going to determine what data we see and how we enact the world differently. And of course, Ken, people are here today because they're really interested in knowing about your cosmic address, what you see from that vantage point, and how you make sense of all this complexity and all this sort of nuance. But since these issues are really, pretty controversial, I think it's important to remind people that, reasonable people can disagree here. At the same time, though, I think it's, it would be rather unwise to not pay attention to what Ken has to say, just considering, the breadth and the scope of the data that you consume and that you metabolize and that you synthesize into your integral theory. So I just wanted to say that. And, I think the other thing, Ken, that I think is going to be interesting about this conversation in particular is, when we did our talk about the major and minor scales of politics, two of the scales that we talked about was altitude and stages and stations. And these were a little bit different. The main idea being here that, we want policy solutions that are coming from people at the highest available altitudes. But at the same time, these policies really need to be able to benefit and to be selected for by the majority of people who are at these lower stages and stations of development. And that gets really, really tricky, as we'll see, I think, with a lot of these issues. So for some of these, I think that, some kind of compromise, some sort of halfway point will work. For others, though, there doesn't really seem to be a lot of neutral compromise available to us. And I think that really any policy solution is going to be embraced by some people and totally rejected by others. And the question here really is, how do we privilege the higher, deeper, wider ethical considerations and solutions? And, while not really steamrolling over the objections from these lower stations. How do we implement a more skillful set of solutions that plays to people's current level of development and, hopefully slowly steers them towards higher stages of thinking and ethical conduct. So we'll see how this sort of situates as we go through these issues. But I think it's a really interesting challenge, and I think is testimony to how much more, again, just nuance the integral model really allows us when we're sort of trying to navigate a lot of issues like these.
And let me just briefly say, and then please finish the introduction, but the whole point about an integral point of view is that it's emphasizing, in a sense, taking the most number of perspectives for the most number of dimensions that you possibly can. And it doesn't mean that there's only one specific answer that you're going to get if you take that overall view. As a matter of fact, there could be an enormous number of different responses. What makes it integral is not the actual specific response you give, but how much of your awareness has actually been activated and involved in making that kind of decision. So as long as you're taking the entire cosmic address into account, then that's fine. And as a matter of fact, what's going to start happening as we get to that 10% tipping point is that it's going to actually change the type of responses that we can give. Because once you have a whole culture that's permeated with integral type of orientations, integral type of perspectives, then that's going to shift the type of responses that culture as a whole will give. And we can't say what that will be right now. It's one of the reasons that, although I'm very concerned with it, I don't get totally overwhelmed or obsessed with coming up with the correct things that we have to be able to say right now that a integral culture will do, because those will themselves change as we hit that 10%, let alone 20% or 30% or 40% of the population. So what we're doing right now are looking at a dozen or so of the hottest hot button issues in culture. And all we're going to say is we're attempting to look at these from the most integral awareness that we possibly can. And here's one solution that an integral consciousness can reach. It's not to say it's the only solution that an integral consciousness can reach. So we'll keep that in mind.
Totally. Yeah, that's such an important piece, Ken. Thank you. Thank you. So, for the purposes of today's dialogue, I thought we would start something, really easy, totally non-controversial. So let's jump into it. Abortion. So, abortion. Alan Dershowitz, Ken, actually said that, what was the quote? Everyone is right when it comes to abortion, which obviously makes, me lean in a little bit. Our job is to figure out who's more right and, what the hell we're supposed to do about it. And, it strikes me, Ken, that this issue, more than really anything else on this list, this seems to be the central fault line in our culture wars, right? I mean, it's the issue that in many ways kind of broke our politics 40 years ago when it first began to get heavily politicized during, the Reagan campaign. And when it comes to single issue voters, I don't really think there's any other single issue that has as many unmovable voters as this one, to the point where, a lot of people are going to actually vote against their own interests, as long as an anti-abortion stance is included, which makes this, that much more complicated. And the fact that people aren't really talking to each other. They're sort of talking across each other. Because until now, this debate has largely been stalled somewhere between, what I'll just call bad metaphysics on the one side and bad materialism on the other. We've got the sort of the amber, every sperm is sacred fundamentalist view. Then there's the orange, fetuses are just parasites until they're born. which is, kind of profane. And, meanwhile, I think Green is just pissed off at us that, we have two men talking about this issue right now. So, I thought we would do, Ken, is I wanted to set the table just a little bit here for this issue. And then, I really want to hear what you say. Because as I was researching this, particularly that divide between amber and orange approaches to abortion, I started, doing a little bit of research around, what does the Bible have to say about abortion? So what is sort of the framework that a lot of the fundamentalist views, anti-abortion views, are coming from? And, it was interesting. First off, one of the things I found is that the only actual explicit mention of abortion in the Bible is actually a recipe for an abortifacient, which is found in, where was it? Numbers 5:11 through 31. And the whole idea here was that this abortifacient was to be given to a woman if she was suspected of adultery. As far as I know, that's the only actual mention of abortion in the entire Bible. But that said, the Bible does have a few things to say about the idea of when does life begin, which is obviously, paramount to this issue. And what I found was that, first off, the idea is that the first human being, Adam, became a living being when God blew into his nostrils and he started to breathe. So the idea being here that life begins with the first breath. So life begins when the baby actually comes out of the womb. Thus the word spirit, which literally means to breathe. And then in Exodus, there's a sort of a famous story. There's a case where a woman gets in between two men who are arguing and gets injured. And that injury causes her to miscarry. If the woman had been killed in that injury, their sort of eye for an eye legal system would have demanded the death of the man who injured her. But in the Bible, the miscarriage was actually treated as a property loss, not as a murder, which, doesn't say a whole lot for how much respect the Bible is affording to children and fetuses.
All right.
It's actually interesting, Ken, because in a certain way, orange has brought in, I think more compassion in a certain kind of sense. Most orange views look at this as a question of viability. At what point is a fetus viable? At what point can it be born and be independent? And they usually peg it around 24, 26 weeks or something like that. Then on the other side of the controversy, we have a lot of concerns around, what people are calling late-term abortions. And before we talk about this, because it is deeply controversial and deeply troubling, I think we should probably throw a little bit of data on the table. It turns out that abortions that take place after 21 weeks make up only 1.3% of all abortions in the United States. Abortions that occur beyond 24 weeks makes up less than 1% of all procedures. And almost all of these procedures, when it is done, are due to the viability of the fetus. Things like the organs are growing outside of the fetus's body and, just doesn't have really a good chance for a good life, or when it's, the mother's life is in danger. Those seem to be really the only time that these quote unquote late term abortions are allowed. And when it comes to this issue sort of more globally, it seems to me that one of the problems that we're stuck in, Ken, is that conservative thinking really seems to emphasize what's called direct causation, which is when they're facing complex issues. It's things like, if you've got an immigration problem, so build a wall. You know what I mean? It's typically like, what is the simplest, almost brute force solution to this very complex problem? Liberals, on the other hand, tend to emphasize systemic causation. And the idea here isn't that one is any more right than the other sort of globally. It's that one is more or less appropriate for a particular issue at a particular time. So when it comes to issues like this, the conservatives are often prohibitionists. They want to make abortions illegal. They want to teach abstinence-only sex education. They want to limit access to birth control. While the liberals tend to be, sort of like mitigation. They want to, maybe influence some of the factors that are feeding into this without sort of a more of a brute force solution. Interestingly, this dynamic sometimes reverses itself. Oftentimes the liberals are the prohibitionists particularly when it comes to things like gun control and tobacco and so forth. But this does seem to be sort of a common thing that we see on the left and the right. So from an integral point of view, Ken, it seems to me that, you know, the answer is actually kind of simple. We want to implement the policy that results in the greatest good for the greatest span, which means reducing suffering however and wherever we can, which means lowering the total number of abortions that are happening. And it just so happens that studies are showing again and again that that solution is actually to legalize abortion and, you know, to offer extensive sex ed and access to contraceptives. But it's, you know, it's tricky because obviously, you know, we've got a good plurality of the country who doesn't believe that. They actually, you know, we're sort of trapped in the interior versus exterior scale that we talked about a couple months ago, where, you know, to a lot of conservatives, this is an issue. This is an interior issue of sexual morality, right? That's why they don't want sex education. That's why they don't want birth control. They want you to not have sex until you get married. They want it to be, you know, meaningful. They want it to be all of these things. And I think that is, you know, that's totally fine for them to hold that station, but it gets really complex when it comes to, you know, creating policies that impact the entire nation. And a final note here, Ken, is something I often use when trying to navigate issues like this is actually, you know, from the Declaration of Independence. I sort of use this as a North Star when thinking through some of these issues. Namely, it's the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the thing here, and I think this is interesting, actually, the thing here is I don't think those three are co-equal, which to me is really profound. I think there's a hierarchical relationship between life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, you know, you have a right to pursue happiness, but not at the expense of my liberty. You have the right to pursue your liberty, but not at the expense of my life. And this lens, you know, brings me a lot of clarity. It's often very useful when I think about issues like this, particularly when it comes to gun control and healthcare and stuff like that. But it gets kind of short-circuited when I'm trying to apply it to abortion, because we're talking about the life and the liberty of both a fetus and an adult woman, and trying to determine who's more entitled to those rights and how to sort of enact this on a policy level. So all that said, what is an integralist to do? When do rights start? And is there something in your mind between sort of the extreme pro-life and the extreme pro-choice stances?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of background issues that we can talk about here. And these are just such fundamental, integral elements that they really have an impact on an enormous number of items, well, throughout the universe, really, but certainly as well in our own culture and in our own society. And we can start with just the definition of a hold-on. And one of the things that we're constantly dealing with, probably one of the central arguments in any cultural arrangement, and certainly in the different political orientations and in our culture wars, is the whole notion of rights and responsibilities, or rights and duties. And there does tend to be a distinction where liberals focus on these are your rights, this is what you get to do, and conservatives focus, and these are your duties, these are the responsibilities that you have to do. There's an enormous amount of argument there, and there are groups that they just completely polarize. There are some that talk only about rights and just an individual liberty, and those tend to be libertarians, of course. And then there are those that focus just on duties and responsibilities and collectives, and those tend to be socialist, communist sorts of orientations. But what we find with a hold-on is that every hold-on is a whole and a part. And it's never just one of those things. And the entire universe, basically, top to bottom, is made of hold-ons. And so if you look at the whole part of a hold-on and you look at the part of a hold-on, the whole part of a hold-on is the part that has rights. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean rights conveyed by the state or anything like that. It just means, in the most fundamental sense, if we're looking at a molecule as a whole, then what are the molecule's rights? I mean, when we say a molecule has rights, what would that possibly mean? When you're describing rights, all you're doing is describing the conditions that are necessary to keep the wholeness whole, to keep it intact, to keep it functioning and working. And if you don't have those things, then that wholeness will dissolve. So if we say, well, we have a plant growing and the plant is a whole, it's also part of other surroundings, but it is a whole. So what are the rights of the plants? Well, you have to water it. It has to have certain nutrients. It has to have sunlight and so on. And if the plant gets those, its rights, then it can continue to exist as a whole. And so to say something has rights, and those rights go all the way down to quarks and atoms, they also go all the way up as far as you want to take it. What you're doing when you describe rights are simply describing the conditions that holon's wholeness part has to have in order to stay whole. Mm-hmm. Now, those always go with certain responsibilities, because those wholes are always parts of other wholes. And to be a part of a whole means that you have to fit in with that whole. You have to mesh with it somehow. And so, in other words, you have certain duties or certain responsibilities. And again, we don't mean at every whole on every level of complexity has rights and responsibilities, but those will vary enormously depending on, just what the environment is, and whether you're just talking about physical qualities like what a plant needs to stay alive, that kind of thing, or whether you're actually talking about human rights, like the rights, the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. But when you're talking about duties and responsibilities, by the time you get to a human holon, we are parts of a larger social unit, among other things. And so we do have duties, we do have responsibilities to that. And those can be centrally important. It also means that there's no such thing as rights without responsibilities, right? Because there's no such thing as wholes that aren't also parts. So the whole notion that we can just have rights or just have responsibilities is insane. And it is true that we have gone, since the 1960s, a little bit heavy on the rights side of the issue. And in part, that's because we were looking at certain minorities that had been marginalized, and we need to approach that carefully, but there's certainly cases where marginalization has occurred. And what that meant was that those people weren't viewed as having a true wholeness themselves. They were just parts that could be moved around and traded and even owned in some cases as property. So we want to say, no, you have rights. And so that means that you have a fundamental right to exist as your own whole entity, not something that belongs to somebody else or that's just a part of something else, and so on. And so we wanted to get those rights. So we passed things with titles like the Civil Rights Act. And that's what we were trying to do. So we're really focusing on rights. Many social commentators think we went too far, and we stopped emphasizing responsibility. And we even stopped talking about it, as if the more rights you had, the less responsibilities you had. But that's not true at all. Those two are always interwoven. And in a certain sense, the more you have of one, the more you have of another. You have to truly balance those and bring them together. So we even have somebody like Jordan Peterson, who now teaches basically that the only way you're going to get meaning in life is by assuming responsibility. And that's all he teaches in a certain sense. You assume responsibility for your life. You clean your room up. Don't go out telling the culture how it's all screwed up when you can't even take care of your own responsibilities in terms of your own existence. And so those are important, and they permeate all aspects of our life, really. And we certainly see it when we look at things like healthcare, like education. Does a person have a right to those? Or do they have some responsibilities in making that happen? How do we match those? These are difficult issues. And one of the problems with social programs is that because people don't have a very integral understanding, because there's not a clear understanding of how everything is a whole on, it's a whole as well as a part, it has rights as well as responsibilities and duties. And so, because that's not an obvious thing to people, they tend to just sort of look at one or look at the other, or if they have their favorite or most problematic issue, they'll tend to emphasize just one, forget about the other, and then they hate anything that is done in terms of social programs. Abortion comes down to which of those wholes has rights, and are we even to consider the fetus a whole? If not, it has no rights. If it is, it has rights. That's the problem. Where does the mother's rights step in as opposed to any rights that a fetus might have? The only thing we know is that to the extent they're both wholes, they both have rights. So that's what has to be figured out. In almost every case, when you end up coming down with some sort of conclusion that you can actually put into play as a social program, and this has certainly been my experience just watching, but I've never seen a social program that was put into place that could just categorically be said that that's the best program and these are all bad. In almost every case, it's the program you're putting into place is the least evil one you can come up with. And the others are just more evil. And that's it. So just get used to it from the start. That's the way it's going. It's true of welfare. It's true for, they're all just variations of disastrous stuff, but we want to make it as least disastrous as possible. And this is particularly the case in terms of getting as large a number of people to be able to get behind a particular program as possible. And so that's a real issue. So what it comes down to, when you look at abortion, is the issue of, are we to consider the fetus a whole in its own right? And if so, then it has a certain amount of rights. And then the question is, okay, certainly the mother is a whole in her own way. She's also a part of several other wholes, and she has a large number of responsibilities and duties, well, just to the society she's in, among other things. If she's part of a family, she'll have responsibilities to that family. If she's part of a teaching program in elementary school, then she has responsibilities that she has to do in order to be part of that organization, and so on. So when we're talking about her being a whole, we're not saying she isn't also part of a whole lot of other things where she has responsibilities. The question is, where do we draw this unit between the mother and the fetus? Mm-hmm. And is that to be looked at in any way as a kind of dual unity? If that's a genuine wholeness in itself, then both the mother and the fetus are part of that. And the mother has responsibilities at that point. And so that is one of the hotly contested issues is this fetus anything that deserves in any way its own degree of wholeness? Is it somehow a thing in itself? Or is it just literally nothing more than a clump of cells that a mother has? It's no different than, let's say, her toenail or her appendix or her hair or anything like that. And if that's the case, then those items are just part of her wholeness. She has no responsibility to them in that sense. She certainly wouldn't have any responsibility to a fetus if it was nothing more than just a clump of tissues that are no different from any other non-necessary clump of tissues that the mother might have. The way that this is usually presented in terms of the fundamentalist religious side, even though, as you pointed out, there's not an enormous amount that you can find in things like the Bible that specifically say things about abortion. In part because there weren't readily available ways that it could sort of just be done as a procedure and it would work out. Of course, folk medicine did have certain types of herbs and stuff that you could use and induce labor prematurely. And you do find that. But it's not a constant ongoing issue the way it is with abortion in today's society. And what happened subsequently is that certain, in particular, fundamentalists would simply take it that the moment of conception is the moment that the fetus becomes a genuine soul. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't matter what its actual sort of bodily shape is, even just one single cell, a zygote, that's got a soul. That's a little bit problematic for several reasons. In some cases, it's worth pointing out that there are at least a fair number of religions, and this includes even in their fundamentalist forms, that maintain that the soul doesn't enter the fetus until a couple months after conception. And so even the Catholic Church, for a first, I think it was millennia or so, maintained that the soul didn't enter the fetus for a few months. Even in Islam today, it's maintained, I don't know the exact amount, it's something like 120 days. That's when the soul enters the body, in the fetus. So that has to be taken, that has to be put on the table if you're just having a religious argument about this. And certainly if you believe something like reincarnation, that's going to change how you view that whole situation anyway. Because even if you had an abortion, the soul would just get recycled back, get in line again, and come on down. But what we're looking at now are things that, on average, most people in today's society consider to be the case And so that's how we would tend to look at something like this.
Mm-hmm.
You can certainly give political arguments that do go to either of those extremes. And you outlined typical ways that happens and typical extremes that people go to. And certainly the sort of extreme fundamentalist, sort of more evangelical, far right position is that abortion is simply bad, period.
Yeah, it's murder.
Yeah, because the fetus has a soul, and it truly is no different from homicide. Mm-hmm. And in both its criminal, social views, as well as its religious views. And that's a bad thing altogether. At the other extreme, you have the far radical left. And it's to a point, well, recently the governor of Pennsylvania maintained, because of a law that was introduced, democratic law introduced in Pennsylvania, that you could perform not just a late-term abortion, but you could perform an abortion even after contractions have started and the infant's on its way out. And the governor of Pennsylvania himself, a child doctor, maintained that you could kill the infant after it's been born. And I mean, literally infanticide. Mm. And that was part of what this law allowed. And that's clearly so far in one extreme direction that it's, I think that truly is homicide. I think that clearly. Because as you're trying to balance all these different types of viewpoints, and let me say one more. We talked a little bit about one of the things that's happened since the 60s is an almost overemphasis on rights. And there should have been a lot of emphasis on rights, particularly given the number of minorities that didn't have rights. And so that's what we wanted to introduce those for. There was a real reason for that. But then it also kind of caught on in part because of the boomers and being known as the me generation. Then the me generation is going to be highly in favor of rights for them and not so excited about responsibilities. I don't need that. Nobody tells me what to do. I don't have any duties.
Fucking boomers.
So, yeah. So we have that whole tendency that we have to be careful about. And it's real. I mean, as you know, I wrote a whole book called Boomeritis on that kind of thing, which turned out to be an understated.
20 years ahead of its time.
Yeah, weird. But one of the things that that got entered on the rights side of the equation, and there's a fair amount of reasonableness to this, even though it can go too far. But part of it was considering the rights of a woman. And one of the major things that changed, that was part of the change that women began to play in society and the increasing role that they began to play in society is not, and again, we've talked a little bit about this, it wasn't that in the past it was nothing but men oppressed women and that shoved them out of society. And they were always trying to fight back, but men were always holding them down. That's a very, 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 there's partial truth in that, but it's also very lopsided. And there were enormous number of other factors that went into that, including a lot of choices on the part of women. Women have agency. And that's one of the problems. Feminism tends to take agency away from women when they want to say, oh, society made women do this, men made women do this. How about women having agency, making choices themselves? They do, and they were part of the choices that made our past cultures. And part of it, some of the women themselves didn't want to be in the public sphere or to be to have the vote, for example, because when you got the vote in most Western cultures, you were expected to fight in war. And women didn't want to do that. And it was still one of the concerns that women had, by the way, when the Equal Rights Amendment was attempted to be put through. They felt that they actually had some special rights and that the Equal Rights Amendment would take that away from them. And so it turned out that the Equal Rights Amendment was defeated because a majority of men voted for it and a majority of women voted against it. So that wasn't men oppressing women. We have to be very careful about that. And there was oppression that occurred. One of the things that had the greatest impact on freeing women from being stuck in some of those earlier roles were indeed the impacts that came in the 1960s, and not just from things like the Civil Rights Act. It was things like the birth control pill. It was things like having abortion more readily available, because these things were just being pregnant and all of the responsibilities that demands, because now you're part of a unit. It's not just you, there's another member in that unit. And as a part of that unit, you have responsibilities. And that's one of the things that really kept mothers limited in what specifically they could do. So as all of that started happening, this was an enormous, if you want to see women, not so much oppressed by men, but confined by their previous roles. Men, by the way, were extremely confined by their roles as well as the disposable sex. But one of the things that really helped women was the not having to be a mother, not being forced to go through that, and the 20 years or so out of your life it's going to take if you continue the responsibilities of a mother. And so that continues to be an important part of what a more feminist-oriented viewpoint takes into account. And that's one of the reasons that even that extreme version of, well, what it's saying when you can say unlimited abortion all the way up through right when you're conceiving is, I refuse to acknowledge that I am part of a holon that includes the fetus. The fetus doesn't have its own wholeness. It doesn't have rights. I'm the only whole here. I'm the only autonomous person here. I'm the only one that has rights here. And therefore, my rights are, I can get rid of that fetus in the same way I can clip my fingernails. I mean, that's literally the way it's viewed. And so that's coming not just from a narcissistic overemphasis on just my rights and me, although there is some of that. But it's also just keeping in account the enormous freedom that being able to be free from motherhood gave the average woman. In other words, it protected her autonomy. It kept her wholeness whole. So she didn't have to be a part of some other whole to which she had responsibilities. And that's one of the main drives of feminism, was to get women out of roles where they were simply a part of a larger unit and they had responsibilities, whether it was to their husbands or whether it was to some traditional roles that society stuck them in. They wanted their own autonomy. They wanted to be their own whole that wasn't a part of those other wholes. Mm-hmm. And that's a central issue that's facing women in the whole abortion debate. I know very, very few women who have had abortions and are proud of it.
That's right.
For every woman that I've talked to that's had it, it's a horrifying ordeal. They hate it. They wish to God's heaven that they didn't have to do it. But they look at that whole 20-year stretch of their life and their own autonomy in that life. And many of them, for example, can't afford, they're trying to get an education. They can't afford that. They're trying to get a job. They don't yet have that. And they're looking at all the things that can impinge on that autonomy, on that wholeness, and the things that can take away from it. And a child takes away from that wholeness about as much as pretty much anything will. And some of them just can't see their life that impacted by that kind of responsibility. And so they need to maintain the right to just be considered nothing but a whole in themselves and not part of a unit that includes a fetus. Because then the fetus has rights and they have responsibilities. And that's one of the issues that's running through their minds. So I just thought, even though I'm a man, that I would try to give that viewpoint, at least as best as I can understand it, because I think it is serious. I think it is real. It's not to say it's 100% right, but it is real. It is there, and it's a serious concern. So it comes back then to, okay, under what conditions would we, just using general principles that we accept elsewhere, what conditions would we consider the fetus to be itself a whole? Not the same as having a soul, we're setting aside the religion for now, but just when can a fetus be considered a whole in its own being? Mm-hmm. And whenever we decide that is, then it becomes a whole on with some sort of rights. And then that's when we had to decide, okay, does that right include the right to life?
Right.
And then if so, then we have to start looking at how to curtail abortion in some ways and to some degree, simply because we're acknowledging the rights that that fetus has, mm-hmm. and that the rights to be considered a whole in its own being. And so it looks like that the best possible type of compromise that we have in terms of both acknowledging some degree of that trajectory from fetus to a birthed human. Mm-hmm. At some point in that trajectory, the fetus takes on a wholeness that has a right to life. Mm-hmm. And the mother is a part of that dual unity. She has responsibilities at that point, not just to a fingernail, but to a living thing. And the death of that living thing is coming into the category of homicide.
Right. Right.
And so the best compromise, and it is a compromise, but I think it's probably, if you had to force both sides to come to an agreement. I think this is the one most of them would come to. And it's fairly well accepted, at least generally, if a person's forced to take their second choice on what to do about abortion. And that is, when does it reach viability, basically? And that, of course, keeps going back a bit and back a bit. It's not a perfect solution because it's viable. What viability really means in these circumstances, it's viable outside the mother's body. It's not viable. I mean, you just can't put it out there and let it run around. And if you have to hook it up usually to some machines and stuff to keep it going. But the point is, now it's a part of another whole that doesn't include the mother. And so that comes out, it varies. It was 26 weeks, now it's sort of 24 weeks. Some people would see it pushing down to 22 weeks, sometime around there. But it's still looking like, just generically, that in the first 2 trimesters, it's not viable.
Right.
And so therefore, we can't say that as a self-supporting living being, that it has its own wholeness yet. And so abortions would be allowed up to that point. And then last trimester abortions would be only under the severest health threats to the mother.
Yeah, those late-term abortions would only be available when the wholeness of either the fetus or the wholeness of the mother is under threat. So the mother's life could end, or the baby could be born with all sorts of birth defects or whatever. That is, it's not going to last very long outside of the womb anyway. And again, for these types of abortions, just to remind everyone again, only 1.3% of abortions take place after 24 weeks. And the vast, 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 vast majority of those are when it comes to health risks for the mother or viability for the baby. So Ken, it sounds like status quo. I mean, this is really the status quo we sort of have right now, is sort of the best way to proceed. And, I just hope the Supreme Court maintains that stance and over the decades to come. And, one interesting thing that I think is really, when you started talking about the question of, when does soul move in? On the one hand, this does sound like a very sort of mythological, amber kind of question, but there's an integral way to ask that question too, which is, you have a whole section on this that we have on the website, which is your hypothesis of subtle energies.
Right.
Embryology in particular is so interesting because it is such a rapid developmental sequence. I mean, we're literally going from a single cell to an entire organism in such a small space of time that, a lot happens during the interim. And the main question seems to be, at what point in that trajectory has the physical matter become sufficiently complex to begin to become a conduit for these subtle and causal energies that you hypothesize?
Right.
That, so we would think anyway, that is when some degree of interiority begins to come online for the fetus while in the womb. And, anyone who's had a kid has, some of their happiest memories are talking to the kid inside the womb and feeling it respond. And it's like, wow, there's an actual life form in there. And of course, that's only possible once that child has developed, up to at minimally the level of irritability in the 4 quadrants.
Right.
But that's when the interiority really starts to come online. And it's a fascinating question that I'm not sure anyone has an answer to, but when you combine embryology with the theory of subtle energies, it gets really, really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Okay.
Cool. Well, let's move on to the next topic. So, and this, in actually some ways, is actually related to the abortion question in terms of bodily autonomy, right? Which is one of the big things that's come out of the abortion debates. How much bodily autonomy does a person have? And I'm gonna combine these 2 issues because I think that they really are sort of 2 sides of a coin in certain ways. So the issues here are the death penalty, should it be legal, versus should euthanasia and assisted suicide be allowed? And just to, give my own very, very brief stance, I am anti-death penalty because I personally think that the state should not have so much power to make these kinds of life or death decisions for an individual. At the same time, well, especially considering how many people have been, put down through the death penalty only to later be discovered that they were actually innocent the entire time. My whole thing is, if there's even a risk of a single innocent person, being killed by the state, we need a better solution here. At the same time, I think that assisted suicide and euthanasia should be allowed, because this isn't the state making a choice. This is about an individual's agency and their rights to decide whether or not they want to terminate their own lives. That said, I do think if that type of thing was to get enacted, I do think there should be a mandatory full mental health evaluation, so that we can figure out whether this person is capable of making these kinds of decisions, which means we're not giving the state the power to say, you live and you die, but we are giving them the power to say whether or not someone is mentally equipped enough in order to make that decision for themselves.
Yep. These are these become choices that we have to make, because on the one hand, we can't just sort of automatically say the state shouldn't have the right to just take a person's life, but the state does have the right to demand all its young men to fight in war and give their lives, for example. And we also, just in terms of a moral principle, one of the problems about the 10 Commandments is they're given just in concrete operational terms. So it's just, you can never do this, you can never do this. The same with murder, you can never do murder. But of course, warfare, you can. Self-defense is universally acknowledged as an allowable murder. If somebody's trying to kill you, you have the right to do that. So it's not that it's stepping over the murder line when we do something like the death penalty. We've already acknowledged that can be stepped over. So the question is, what rights do we have to do that? Self-defense, got it. Warfare, okay, and yeah, that's a little bit half and half, but yeah, that does demand certain people put themselves possibly into murder situations. People like Hegel felt that if somebody did a crime that was so heinous that they had just disconnected themselves from the moral values of the universe, that then they didn't have a right to participate as a human in that, and so you could have the death penalty. I happen to agree with you, and I think the death penalty, on balance, is not an example of when we should be allowed to step over that line into murder. And if not even for moral reasons, then almost certainly for practical reasons. And one of them you mentioned, the number of people that can get accidentally murdered because they were innocent but got judged guilty. That's an alarming fact. And we have, even something like the Innocence Project that Barry Sheff and some lawyers founded. And what it's done is, because of what DNA can show us, they've gone back and taken people who were found guilty and committed to often life without possibility of parole, which would have meant death penalty, and found a very high percentage of them to actually be innocent. Another very disturbing fact is the repeated demonstrations that the death penalty isn't evenly applied between minorities. And that's just in itself alarming enough to stop it. And so for me, since it is a voluntary induction of death, then the criteria for being able to do that have to go quite high. And certainly self-defense, well, that's sort of 100%. That, yeah, not a problem. If somebody's doing that, that's a problem. Part of the criteria on death penalty would be, prove to me you won't get it wrong. If you can demonstrate that, then we'll have that moral discussion, and I might agree with you and say, yeah, Hegel's right. Let's disconnect this person from the moral value structure of the universe. They already disconnected themselves. So, and one of the things that drives people to believe in the death penalty, of course, is some absolutely horrifying, heinous, devastatingly vicious crime. And it's just, and we have, unfortunately, a large number of those that happen too often. And it's one person, torturing, brutalizing, suffocating, raping another one, burning them alive, and then throwing them, in a garbage dumpster. It gets so many people so emotionally and viscerally upset that almost the only thing that feels right is kill them, kill them, kill them. And I totally understand that. And it's actually something that can be put on the table as part of the things that we would want to consider. But again, you have to get over that hump for me. Demonstrate you won't get it wrong. Demonstrate you're not going to put away an innocent person, or that you're not going to put away 3 Black people to every one person you put away. You want to do that, and then we'll have that discussion. But until then, it's the integral conclusion's very straightforward. Don't do that. Now, I also agree on euthanasia and assisted suicide. And here we also, one of the things that we run into are the strong, more fundamentalist religious beliefs. And that is that life was given by God, and nobody has a right to take that, including we don't have a right to take that ourselves. Again, this is switched a little bit if you take reincarnation account. Yep. There's so many wonderfully good things that happen if reincarnation is real, that it's high on the list of, if you could wish something to be real and it would be real, I'd put that up there somewhere. First of all, death penalty, sure. Somebody does this, teach them a lesson, send them back, recycle them. They'll just be back again. They'll have learned, to do better. Be an actual learning lesson. So many things change when something like that happens. But we can't count on that. In the meantime, euthanasia, assisted suicide. I remember the nightmares that occurred when Dr. Kevorkian, they used to call him Dr. Death, tried to introduce this. I think on balance, that was an extraordinarily courageous and heroic person. And he made it really clear. I mean, he would try to talk people out of suicide. He would make sure that they really didn't have an option. But then for people that were in intractable pain and suffering and said, I want to do this, of course they have the right to do it. If you have the right to life, you have the right to take it. And that's your choice. As your own autonomous wholeness, that's your right. And I believe that's absolutely the case. So I think, yes, of course, you want to be very, very, very careful about stuff like that. And particularly people that have really severe depression. It's probably one of the most common things about severe depression that people said, I really wanted to kill myself. I really wanted to kill myself. And I even tried once or twice. And then they can actually get better. They can get some sort of treatment that helps. And one of the first things they'll say is, thank God I didn't kill myself.
Yeah.
And so we know that it's a delicate area, but letting it go forward in general with certain amount of precautions. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me say, Ken, I love it when you agree with me because it makes me feel so smart.
Yeah. Excellent.
So the next issue, and this is one that is a bit personal for me, particularly the first part of the question. So the question is, what money can't buy? Should some things, such as healthcare or prisons, be exempt from the profit motive? And this is a huge one for me, Ken. I mean, most people watching probably know my story, but I had a daughter 6 years ago who was born with a really bad health condition that required her to get a liver transplant at the age of 1.5 years old. And it was, I still, when I start talking about it, I kind of shake a little. It was a very tough.
Why?
Yeah. It was
horrifying.
It was absolutely. I mean, it was the most terrifying thing I've ever walked through. And the funny thing about it was all of this happened literally a week after the Affordable Care Act was enacted. If the timing had been different, if this had happened 6 months prior or a year prior or what have you, there's a very, very good chance that our insurance company would not have covered her transplant or would have limited her transplant to, some sort of cap of we'll pay for the first $1 million, but that's it. And one of the things about when you get an organ transplant is you're sort of always waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? So we don't know if or when she'll need another transplant. Hopefully never. But I want to do everything I can while I'm here, and I have my own hands on the wheel here to enact a world where a girl like her doesn't need to worry about her pre-existing conditions for the rest of her life, where she doesn't feel the need to, for example, only work at one company her entire life because they're the only ones who offer an insurance plan that's good. I mean, the American healthcare system is corrupted to the core, and a lot of people, myself included, point to the fact that at the very center of the insurance model, which is exactly the wrong model to use for healthcare, but the very center is the profit motive. And that's not to say that profits are a bad thing, that capitalism is a bad thing. I love me some capitalism, but not for certain things. And, a couple episodes again, I sort of glibly described myself as a Maslow socialist. And what I mean by that is it's my belief that the very first rungs of Maslow's hierarchy, particularly safety needs, should be given to us by the state. In other words, we should give it to ourselves through the medium of the state. And that includes everything that we already have, such as, the fire department. We don't have to pay the fire department before they, put the fire out in our house. To the police department, I think it extends all the way to Medicare. To healthcare. I'm a big Medicare for all proponent. I think that is the best solution moving forward in terms both of quality of care and access to that care. So I do think that there are certain things that when it comes to the profit motive, it makes everything needlessly complicated, not to mention the fact that it adds to the suffering that people are going through when they're dealing with health crises. And it's amazing how just removing that stress can actually accelerate the healing process. Not to mention the fact that if we were to move away from an insurance space, a for-profit insurance space, this actually allows for more innovation and entrepreneurship among ordinary people, because as I mentioned earlier, they no longer feel the pressure to stay at a shitty job they don't like just because of the benefits. And they're afraid that making some sort of transition, they'll lose those benefits. So I think there's a big economic gain in providing for these kinds of resources for people, especially since, even after the Affordable Care Act, the number one cause of bankruptcy is still medical bankruptcy. And what you're doing when a person declares bankruptcy is you're allowing them to slip underneath the social safety net. And they are then creating more drag upon the economy for the rest of us. And I think that eliminating that drag, creating a better, albeit probably still imperfect system is going to be much more beneficial to us collectively and individually. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Well, it's an enormously complicated issue, and there are, of course, a lot of good arguments on both sides of the issue. I think the top 17 developed countries all have some sort of universal health care for their citizens. Mm-hmm. Almost all of them also have sort of notorious complaints about how bad it is. Mm-hmm. One really good study on healthcare talked about three factors. One was universality, one was affordability, and one was quality. And the conclusion was you can have any two of those, just not all three. And so once you choose universality, then you're going to get either affordability or quality, and you can't get both. So if you don't want it to cost a bloody ass fortune, then the quality of it tends to go down. And particularly if you don't have something like some kind of profit motive for medical discoveries allowed, then you do tend to get less innovative systems. That was certainly the conclusion of this particular study.
Now, these drugs are expensive. Pharmaceuticals are expensive. The research and development costs are massive. They're absolutely massive. So
exactly. And that's why people like from Britain or Canada they get basic coverage there and they're fine. But if they need any sort of leading edge, really high quality medicine, they try to come to America. Mm-hmm. We, of course, have we have the worst of all possible worlds almost, because we don't have a single universal system. And it's sort of half insurance, half government, sort of half Medicare, Medicaid, and half country, almost the worst of both possible worlds. And that's why, in terms of, even though our innovative medicine, and we do most of the innovations in medical care and in medicine. And so, for example, in terms of like 5-year cancer survival rates, America's number one. Mm-hmm. But then in terms of just overall medical care, we rank somewhere between 37 and 50th worldwide. It sucks. And one of the reasons it sucks too is that Americans have one of the worst diets in the known universe, and that it really doesn't help. So it's a massive problem, and one of the things that's going to have to start happening in order to really address this universality, affordability, quality issue is that many more integral factors are going to have to be brought into that picture in order to start arriving at something that works better than we have now. It's not completely clear, given all of the data, and I've looked into it a lot, it's not completely clear exactly which direction that's going to go. We do have certain fundamental beliefs, just given how far culture in general has evolved over the past 50 to 100 years, that there are more and more things become what we believe are our rights. Mm-hmm. And in terms of just in nature itself, if we just track rights up to that level, when just the first humans emerged, there was no right for education, there was no right for healthcare, there was no really. I mean, rights in terms of the way we were defining it was basically physiological shelter. You had to have that. Some sort of food. So there was the daily hunt. And then some sort of child rearing processes. And then also some capacity for self-defense if you've gotten in a fight with another tribe. And that was about it in terms of any rights that you could look for if you were born into that tribe. And then as we continued, we started to say, well, okay, wait a minute. Food is starting to look more like it should be a right. So we really don't let anybody starve in this country. We do have things like food stamps and so on. Education, we decided, was not only a right for individuals, it was a right that society as a whole had to have, because you can't have a functioning democracy unless you have a fairly educated citizenship. And the founding framers even believed, more than educated, that we actually had to have moral, virtuous people in this country, or the Constitution wouldn't work. And we tend to forget that. But we've added that education at least to 12th grade. And now, because a college degree is the new 12th grade, in terms of what you're expected to have, now we're sort of, let's get free college. Let's get that up and running. And then, of course, healthcare, that's a new right. And that's what we feel should happen. One of the things we just have to be careful about are these extremist points of view. I mean, just simply going and saying, we're going to give health care to absolutely everybody. We're going to give education to absolutely everybody. We're going to give free housing to absolutely everybody. We're going, those, you know, the numbers that have been run on things like that. One of the last ones I saw was $89 trillion. And there's enough of me integrating conservative and liberal to say, okay, who's going to pay for that size a number? We've got to take that into account. So we do have all these factors. I happen to believe that some degree of education is indeed becoming more of a right. Again, as there's an education inflation going on. And I say the new high school degree is at least a 2-year community college degree. And so we have to really start looking at that. We do have to get our healthcare situation straightened out, and looking at universality, affordability, and quality. One of the problems that we do have is that right now we're selecting for medical innovation or quality, but universality, it continues to be really spotty, and affordability is just got off the wall because we've got the worst of ways to try to manage this so far. So that's an issue that I think we have to take care of seriously. And when I say more integral point of view, one of the really curious things about what money can do is if you look at a general 4-quadrant map, and you actually get a kind of giga glossary, and you put phenomena that we know exist at all levels, in all quadrants, in all lines. Money can buy most of the things in the right-hand quadrants. Mm-hmm. And it can't directly buy anything in the left-hand quadrant. So it can buy you physical health. I mean, to the extent you can go buy a doctor, buy a hospital, pay for medical care, but it can't give you psychological well-being or a sense of well-being. It can't buy you love. It can't buy you intellectual understanding. It can't buy you anything in the left-hand quadrants. What it can do is, because various things in the left-hand quadrants do grow and develop and evolve, and many of them can be learned to some degree and accelerated, then money can help buy you the circumstances that will help foster some left-hand entities. And so that's what we do with the compulsory 12th grade education. That's taking place in the right-hand quadrant. It's an actual school building with actual materials and actual physical teachers doing it. But it's helping our awareness in the left-hand quadrants become ever more developed and more evolved. And we've decided it's just a rough cutoff. You can't have a functioning democracy without a 12th grade, by the way. So one of the things that you have to look at very carefully is just how much money do you put into those institutions that foster the things that we want on the left hand? And you want to be very careful about that, because the standard, conservatives will always say, we can't just throw money at it. And in a sense, that's right. I mean, you really have to look very, very carefully at how to do it. We have one thing we're talking about education and whether we just do something like pay children for learning. So I'll just jump to that really quickly and comment on that as an example. That's a way to get money as an incentive into the left-hand quadrants in a wrong way. Because also one of the things you have to remember about it, every time you get money involved, you also increase the capacity for corruption. Yep. Because that's what can happen. And so that's not a reason not to do it. It's just you have to take that into account, because it's always going to come with it. It's always going to come much more than you think it will. And it's going to mess up your program much more than you thought. Totally. You really have to take that into account.
Yep. Yeah, and what it does, Ken, I think that type of approach feeds into this sort of flatland neoliberalism that we live in today, where, you know, as you and I were talking about a couple of days ago, all qualities get reduced to quantities. And, you know, I think this is a perfect example of that. And then, you know, the risk of that is that money then becomes the substrate of meaning in a certain kind of sense. And that's exactly the wrong trajectory to go.
Yeah, it's one of the real problems. And it's been one of the problems with the Marxist-inspired approaches. There's a lot of very smart stuff in an overall Marxist agreement. And there's some very, very confused things about it. And one of the problems is reducing all of life's problems to economic class problems. And we even know, for example, just in terms of life happiness, in terms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the data on that's really quite clear. Mm-hmm. As you track people's happiness, when they're deeply poor, very unhappy. Yep. And it's correlated. As you give them more money, they get more happy, and then more money, more happy. And then at some point, you keep giving them money and they don't get more happy, and you give them more money and they don't get more happy. And at some point, way up here, they start to get weird.
More money, more problems.
Exactly. And, you know, only the rich can have certain really severe problems. Well, the great soap operas are made by people that are rich enough to sit around and start pondering their problems and then get into cocaine and then go off the deep end. Yep. But that amount of money seems to be where it stops, happiness stops going up. This amount of money seems to be the amount that you can basically pay all of your necessary life costs. Mm-hmm. And in other words, keep the bill collectors off your door. And so that's making somewhere in the sort of lower middle class, that kind of thing. And then more than that, it isn't quite working. And if you've reduced your whole societal issues to just a class financial warfare, then you're not going to address any of the issues over here.
Yeah.
Address.
Yeah. I heard it was it's adjusted for cost of living, so it varies from region to region, but it's on average about $70,000. Once you hit the 70,000 mark, it's rapid diminishing returns after that.
Right. So if you take something like learning, There, and it's one of the things that integral approaches take very, very seriously. And that's that in almost every discipline that you look at that actually has to produce some sort of product or result, there are usually some sort of best practices that each of those actual disciplines knows about. They're often not well known to other people, but they are well known within small groups of people that work on those specific types of problems. And so you really want to look for those. So one of the biggest problems we have in education, for example, and particularly inner city urban schools, is classrooms where kids are just completely disruptive, always interrupting the teacher, just completely being incorrigible. And there's almost nothing they seem to be able to do about that. So the questions be, well, how about paying? And that doesn't work that well. What does work extremely well is a process where the kids are, and it's often used referred to as best education or good education practice. The whole class decides, makes a list on the board about what's good behavior and what's bad behavior. And they come up with them themselves. Mm. And what's interesting, of course, is the lists are almost always the same because everybody knows, hitting the teacher, not good. Right. Talking out of turn, not good, all that. And what's good is paying attention, studying, doing homework. They know, and they make the list. And then for however long they're doing this, if it's for the particular semester or whatever they're doing it, they track themselves, and the kids self-monitor. So they're the ones that actually call other ones when they do it. And when they do something right, they get points. And when they do something wrong, they get demerits. And then at the end, winners, and the winners are often just determined across the board in terms of just a specific number. So it's not that you're fighting against other people to beat them. You're fighting to beat a particular, like par for the course kind of thing. And then if you do, you get just a small reward. And here it's almost behavioristic. It doesn't really matter. It's just that you're getting a reward. So it could be like a small plastic truck or a doll or some sugar-free gummy bears or anything like that. Disruptive class behavior goes down about 80%.
Wow.
It's stunning. Yeah. And learning skyrockets. Yeah. I mean, it's like 4 and 5 times greater results. And nobody knows about these things because those kinds of best practices don't really get out there. And one of the things that integral approaches do, of course, because we think that, everybody's right out, just find them. And so we pay a lot of attention to that kind of stuff. And there's a fair amount of it in education. There's not as much in healthcare.
Right.
We're still trying to check that one out. But books like I just mentioned, when they're starting to analyze it in these more integral terms, I think is going to help. And certainly my own druthers is that as we move forward, we can find ways that we can genuinely afford to pay for these things.
Yeah.
So that affordability can join quality and universality and not keep being the thing that sinks it.
Yep. Well, we're already overpaying for lower quality care. So, I mean, it seems like something can be done there. I love the point you made about those educational strategies. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're actually allowing the kid to participate with creating this ethos rather than having it sort of, shoved down their throats or shoved on their head.
The cops. They don't have the cops watching over them.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the real keys to it.
That's really cool. And, Ken, the other thing is I think that these issues in general, just, what do we hand off to capitalism? What do we hand off to socialism, for example? I think it's an interesting question that's going to get even more complicated as these, big technological movements start coming down the line. Once we hit, a fully automated workforce, Jesus, what is that going to do for us? Once we hit, all these things from robotics to genetics, all of them are going to have such a hugely disruptive effect on how we self-organize as a society, that it's probably not a bad idea to try to get ahead of some of these issues right now. And, my sense is that, looking out at the world and looking back at history, things like libertarianism and communism, these are always ideologies that sound and look really nice when they're on paper. And the minute you start actually trying to enact them in the real world, they just fall apart. They fall apart very, very quickly. And it's very hard to find any society that is 100% libertarian or 100% socialist, etc. Usually what we see is the most successful, the most vibrant economies, and the economies where we find the most interior happiness are mixed economies, which makes a whole lot of sense because socialism helps raise the floor and capitalism helps raise the ceiling. Well, hey guys, let's do both at the same time.
And one of the ways that seems to work is keeping the distinction which Marx first raised, and the way he first defined communism was that workers, not the state, workers own the forces of production. And that was called the labor theory of value, that something's value is determined by the labor that you put into it. And what he saw capitalism doing is certain people owning these means of production. Therefore, they get all the profit, and you have to alienate your own labor and just get paid basically nothing because you're being exploited. And that was the problem. That what that doesn't take into account is just the different drives and interests that human beings themselves have. You can't just take, let's say, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and assume that out of any 100 people, you're going to get those two, that they're just going to show up and automatically do what they're supposed to do. Yep. Capitalism has the advantage that it does allow that kind of initiative to get rewarded. And nobody's oppressing anybody when that happens. I mean, you can sell your labor for whatever you want. If you want to sell it for more, you go to medical school. I mean, if you spend all of your day making mud pies, okay, well, you put in 12 hours a day, but that's not exactly worth much. So, nobody's alienating you because you want to make mud pies. But what happens with capitalism is that you do have some of these individual ownership when the entrepreneur themselves thought of the idea and often created the technology that let it get started. And so that's one of the advantages of capitalism. One of the disadvantages is that whenever we have hierarchies, and there are growth hierarchies, which are good, and there are dominator hierarchies, which are bad. But in either case, there's inequalities that are created. Yep. And because of that, we have to, there are even things like Pareto principle and Price's law that says whenever any item is being produced, then the square root of the number of people producing it actually make about 50% of the goods. Mm-hmm. So if you have 100 farmers, 10 of them are producing 50% of the food. Mm-hmm. If you have 100 novelists, 10 of them are writing 50% of the novels, and so on and so on. So the question is, that's true with socialism or capitalism. So the question is, okay, what do you do about the 50% that, even if they're working, aren't getting enough goods to let them live comfortably? They can't afford healthcare. They can't afford education. What do you do about that? This is where we have these two different answers, and this is where we have to mix these two, but we have to make sure we get the best of both of them. So one of the things we don't want to do is make all the forces of production owned by the state. Because again, that's going to stop the Steve Jobs and all that from producing their stuff. So you do, and this is what the Scandinavian countries do. They're capitalist countries. Mm-hmm. They're not socialist countries. They still have private ownership. People still go out and make companies and do it. It's just they tax the hell out of them. Right. So they do take about 60% taxes. And that's, if you're gonna try to mix them, that's the way to do it. You let capitalism make the pie and then socialism divide it. Yep. Don't let socialism make the pie. There won't be a pie. Yep. And every time that's been tried in the 20th century, it's produced not only economic disaster, but literally hundreds of millions of murders, of deaths. Every place has been tried, no exceptions. Yep. So we know the history of that. It's horrifying. So both of those mixed together in the best way. Yeah. Yep.
Maslow socialism for the win.
Yeah.
All right. Next issue. Okay. This is a challenging one, Ken. So the question is, are the costs of drone strikes, namely civilian casualties, worth the benefits? Which is basically our own troops not getting killed or injured or even having to go to the war theater at all. And I think this is the reason I think this is so fascinating is that I think it's actually two questions. Because there's a question of the technology itself, which is in most ways values neutral, you know, and also not to mention entirely inevitable. As soon as a new technology comes online, it's going to get used for warfare. Because if you don't, someone else will, and suddenly you don't have a military anymore.
You can't outlaw technology.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And for anyone who wants to really get into Ken's view on this, I encourage you to check out a dialogue that Ken did years ago with Kevin Kelly, talking about the evolution of what Kevin Kelly calls the technium, and which really emphasizes on how neutral these technologies are. Where it gets really problematic, obviously, is how human beings choose to enact these technologies. So you've got the technology on the one side, but then you've got what are you doing with it? You've got sort of the moral decisions behind it. And I don't think anyone would disagree that killing civilians in warfare is terrible. Not only is it terrible and unethical and immoral, it's counterproductive. You're actually creating that much more opposition against you. You're creating that much more insurgency. In a lot of ways, it's the same reasons why torture doesn't work. Because all you're doing is you're actually creating this feedback loop with what exactly doesn't work. So it's obviously limited when it comes to that. But at the same time, I do think there's a place for drone warfare to be used, almost with a scalpel, not with a chainsaw. The other thing, Ken, is that we can talk about this now. It's going to be a completely different conversation 10 or 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years from now, when artificial intelligence really starts taking off. And suddenly we've got artificial intelligence deciding who an enemy combatant is and who's not. And that's terrifying. I've seen RoboCop. I remember that robot ED-209 that, couldn't even go up the stairs.
Right.
I remember this story.
Yep.
And that sounds terrifying. So what is your view on this?
Yeah, well, I agree, first of all, that the killing of civilians is it's not allowed. I mean, going even back to things like the Geneva Convention, that's the one thing that you just don't do. Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, that applies, a corollary to that is if you have soldiers who are fighting and a soldier surrenders, mm-hmm. then it's no longer a soldier. You take him out and you put him in a prisoner of war camp or something, you keep him till the end of war, but you can't shoot him anymore. And so it's a real issue. One of the things that, particularly as technology increases, I talked a little bit earlier about that bump that was required to get over in order to have capital punishment. You have to demonstrate you're not doing it inadvertently to somebody who doesn't deserve it. Mm-hmm. Well, my thought about drones is that, and this is just something that the military would have to decide on, but whatever percentage that's allowed of civilians to be killed, first of all, that should be as low as absolutely possible right now. And it should, continue to go down and down and down. And if we can't guarantee a fairly low number right now, then don't do it. And then as technology gets better and we can much more surgically use it, that's fine. Mm-hmm. But this is all set in the context of a much bigger issue, which is just the whole integral way that we look at international relations and warfare itself, and all the wars that the United States has gotten into, and in particular, driven by the notion that all we really have to do is go into some of these red societies, bomb the hell out of them, and then put a green culture on top of them, and it'll all work great. And of course, it's a disaster that never, ever works. Yeah. And if you ever get the country to a point where it can manage to have elections, it just elects the next strong man dictator. And they actually look for that. I mean, it's one of the rules of red, is that red follows strong dictatorial assholes. I mean, that's, so until we get the left-hand quadrants back into our cultural discussion, yeah. That certainly includes education, and it certainly includes just the culture at large and various types of jobs and tasks. It certainly includes politics and how we handle voting and stuff like that. But all of those issues have to be taken into account. And certainly until we do that with international politics and things like specifically warfare, we shouldn't be over there shooting drones around anyway. Right. And we're certainly not doing it with developed countries. We're not saying, okay, how many drones do we want to use against Germany because they won't accept enough Coca-Cola machines? I mean, that doesn't happen. Those questions come up only, well, we're bombing the hell out of some third world country. How should we do that fairly? And then, we're going to kill some civilians. Well, who cares? They're third world primitives that lose a few here or there. Big deal. And that's all completely screwed up because the foundation's so messed up. So
and there's something to be said also, Ken, about the sort of the evolution of warfare itself. So, 20,000 years ago, if you are, conducting warfare in another society, you literally are seeing the whites of their eyes when you're making, the killing blow. Now it's like push button, remote control. I mean, it feels like a video game. And that's how a lot of the drone operators actually describe it. They actually say they actually get a lot of PTSD because of the disconnect between how easy it is to push those buttons versus the human cost as a result of pushing that button. They're not completely separated from the traumas that come with, I just extinguished human life by going boop. And it's kind of crazy. And the amount of dehumanization that actually allows. So sort of the farther away from your enemy you are, the easier it is to dehumanize them.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that happen in our cultural evolution is that often technology sort of inched forward because the first places that new technologies were either invented or first tried were in weapons. Mm-hmm. Means of weapons. And so if you track how wars went, somebody always got a little advantage in weaponry and they would win. And then that would go on until somebody else got a little advantage and they would win. One of the biggest, and I think this is the group that did it, but the Mongolians were one of the first to discover a simple stirrup for a horse. And what that actually meant was you could sit in a horse, sit up and shoot a bow and arrow.
Yeah.
And Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan conquered the known world because they could sit up in a horse and shoot bows and arrows, and nobody else could. They go, what the hell is that? So those and then we got the crossbow, and then we got chain link armor, and and you just on and on and on. Archimedes, the famous Archimedes, invented 2 or 3 staggeringly effective war machines that gave the Greeks enormous advantage in the wars that they were in, included things like catapults. I mean, it's just astonishing. So that all happened right up until nuclear weapons. And then in a 13-day period in October in 1963, the world realized for the first time in history, and this is the first time it's ever happened, we could literally destroy ourselves entirely with nuclear warfare. And we thought we were. It was actually that far away. It's still absolutely sheer luck that we didn't do it. And that stopped that kind of eye-to-eye warfare. Now it's shifting to technological warfare.
Yep.
And so that's what we're seeing. China, coming in, stealing intellectual property. That's where the warfare is nowadays.
Yep. And it's a better warfare, right? I mean, market-based warfare is a lot better than dragging an entire army into a field and just shooting at each other until no one's left standing. This is a better state of affairs. And at the same time, between, all the bots on the internet and all the drones in our sky and issues with plutocracy that we were talking about a couple episodes ago, I mean, it starts to feel like we're living in like a 1980s William Gibson cyberpunk.
It all starts to look like Blade Runner. And this all moves forward until something like China figures out how to bust into an electrical smart grid over here and then shuts down all the electricity in New York City for, several months. So that's part of the main problems that we're facing right now.
Yeah, and it only gets weirder from here. I think a nice follow-up question to this is, which we can probably get through pretty quickly. What about the draft? Should we reinstate the draft? Do you think that mandatory military service is actually a good thing for society, or was that a positive sort of evolution once we were able to? Now, let's be clear, we never got rid of the draft. We found other ways to incentivize military service, and we haven't had to enact the draft, at least in a few decades.
Well, part of what we're facing now, and we talked about this a little bit at an earlier time, which is the necessity of how we build collective hold-ons, social hold-ons on the way to an actual global village with a world federation. And sort of what's the smallest unit of that you can get. And right now, it looks like the nation state is about the smallest. It doesn't look like you can go from something like being brought up in Poughkeepsie, Iowa, and then going from Poughkeepsie to World Village in terms of really an effective psychological identity.
Especially Poughkeepsie.
Yeah. So given that, and then also given the point that is relatively new in Western cultures, is the degree of polarization that we have between these political orientations that we can have. And those are deeply, deeply cutting into a person's sense of being part of a larger group of something just be called Americans. And again, you don't have to feel, hyper patriotic or be a nationalist or anything like that. It's just a matter of how you can extend the boundaries of what you recognize as your collective and extend it beyond just a simple agreement with a certain number of people on a chat room. And that's a real problem. Mm-hmm. And so one of the ways to handle something like that is to actually have a national service. Kennedy, JFK came up with the Peace Corps, for example, yep. Which at that time was a wonderful idea in terms of some of the ideas that it mixed. There is a fair amount to be said for a national service corps. It's certainly the case that being 18 years old right now is just a little bit too early to determine in all cases just exactly what you want to be for the rest of your life.
Man, I'm in my 40s and I'm still figuring it out.
I know, it's really an issue. And so if we put just a year or two in there where people get a chance to actually meet other groups, meet other people, be forced to take other perspectives and stop being just in a group where you can just echo chamber your perspective and never have to take something different. And somebody shows up on a college campus who disagrees with you, shout them down. Whatever else you do, don't talk to them. Don't have an interaction with them. Shout them down. Give them the heckler's veto. And that's not good.
Right.
And that kind of polarization, absolutely, if it, the ultimate endpoint of that is an actual physical war, is an actual civil war. And there are even some fairly sober social commentators saying that that's a possibility if this keeps up. So a national service would help with something like that. Because even if you're going to disagree with that person in the bunk next to you, you're going to have to learn how to deal with it.
That's right.
You're not going to just be able to shout them down and not have to engage with it anymore.
Yep.
It's a real issue. Jonathan Haidt has tracked those moral psychologists that have looked at the different types of moral cultures that human beings tend to have. And it went from early mythic ethnocentric stages of what was called an honor ethic, where you had honor if you did something and stood out and were something that you could be a hero for or something like that. And then in the modern era, it moved into a dignity ethic, where you don't have to have people agreeing with you. You have dignity and self-esteem just for yourself and just for what you are. And now it's moved into what they actually call a victim ethic. You don't get the goods unless you're a victim. You have to prove how you're a victim one way or another. And there's actually sort of, Jonathan Haidt actually ranks them into a victim hierarchy. And of course, the one on the absolute bottom, if it gets on the hierarchy at all, is white cisgendered European males. And they're the cause of everything bad that happens to everybody else. Well, even if we leave those out, identifying yourself as you move out from your teen ages into just identifying with one of those groups, what happens when you identify with the tribe is you identify with just the way that tribe is different from all the other tribes. You don't look at what that tribe has in common with all the other tribes. That would be world-centric. No, you just look at how this is different from that. If you're focused on just being a woman, well, this is how a woman, you don't say, oh, and this is what we have in common with men. No, they're wrong. Well, that's a bad way to grow your identity. And it's headed on ultimately, by the way, to an identity with the entire universe. Right. So if you're there cutting out tribes left and right, you're not going to make it. It's not going to happen. Yeah. And so having some sort of national service for a year or two at the most, there's more reasons in favor of that than there are against it right now. It's a close call, but I think you can make a very good argument for it.
Yeah, Ken, I'm actually in total. I was surprised when I read this question how, sort of in a sense conservative my response was. Because, what I certainly don't want is, you watch like, what was the movie? Gangs of New York, and has this great scene where all the Irish are coming off the boat and, from other countries too. A lot of them can't even speak English, at least not very well. And they're forced to sign this contract and they're just brought right over onto this other boat and they're shipped off to war. I mean, certainly we don't want that. And I think we agree that when it comes to something like a draft, we're not saying we want 18-year-olds to just get shipped off to Afghanistan and that's
right.
what happens. But I totally agree that when it comes to things like the Peace Corps, when it comes to things like the National Guard, I think there's a lot of good that can be done here. And not only does it can help us with the polarization problem, but it also helps us overcome this malignant apathy and cynicism that I think has largely been rolling in increasingly so ever since the end of the Vietnam War. And ever since we basically did away with the draft, which, made a certain kind of practical sense for the government to make that decision because their military decisions were not very popular. And they were dealing with a possible revolt among the electorate unless they found a different kind of approach here. But I think something really, really important was lost there. Something was saved, namely millions of young American lives who aren't getting shot at. Right. But something was also lost. And I think there is something about our collective national identity, which is a healthy patriotism, which is a healthy, as you say, it's expanding your we until it's big enough to where everyone in this country can fit in. And, it doesn't take a whole lot of steps after that until you're able to expand your identity to immigrants coming into your country. Even, hey, illegal immigrants. And then, hey, all Canadian. I love Canadian. You know what I mean? It just keeps growing and growing and growing. And I think that that creating this sort of mandatory, as you say, should only be a year, maybe 2 if you opt into more of it. But, I think that 1 year is enough to remind people how important it is to not only embrace everyone else around you, but also to, it makes us more civically engaged. And I think that is probably my number one hope for the newer generations coming up is that they are more civically engaged than certainly my generation was, Gen X. And that's largely because you guys, the boomers, told us, hey guys, don't worry about that whole civics thing. We already figured that all out in the 60s. You just consume, and find your happiness and everything's taken care of for you. Well, as a result, look at our politics. Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to another issue that is very personal for me. Should people be forced to be vaccinated, even if some believe it can cause autism? I want to be as clear as I can here. Vaccines don't cause autism. There's so much research looking at this. Now, what we do know is that not all vaccines should probably be mandatory. I think that we can have conversations about timing of vaccines, et cetera. But I think that this is evidence of, again, what social media has sort of done to us, this Dunning-Kruger effect that social media has had, where suddenly all of us are not only expert, political scientists, but we're also expert doctors who can second guess genuine expertise in the field. And as a result, we are seeing, as if we didn't have enough problems today, we're seeing a resurgence of measles. We're seeing, what do we want polio to come back? I mean, this is kind of nuts. And again, it's very personal for me because, as I mentioned earlier, with my daughter's medical journey, she's immunosuppressed, which means she depends on herd immunity in order to not contract one of these really, really nasty illnesses. And sad to say, I live in Boulder County, where not a single school in Boulder County has a level of vaccinations that reaches herd immunity. And that's because Colorado has one of these personal exemptions laws on the books when it comes to vaccines. And I also want to emphasize, this is not a liberal problem. It is a liberal problem, but it's not only a liberal problem. There's also extreme conservatives who are anti-vaccination. They tend to approach it from sort of different angles, but they both agree that vaccines are killing all of us, turning all of our kids into, autists, and and this is a big problem. And it's, you know, I'm not going to lie, it's a little bit scary. My own personal view on this is I do think you should have a right to not vaccinate your kid. I think that's fine. However, I think that there should be consequences to that decision. For example, I don't think public schools should be available to you. If you want to not vaccinate your kid and put them into a private school, okay, that's a decision you can make. But again, when my 6-year-old can't find a school that has the level of herd immunity required for me to feel confident that, you know, she's not going to get the measles or, you know, anything like that, that's an issue. And again, I just want to be clear. I think this applies mostly to things like MMR vaccines. I understand parents who have a different memory of what it was like to get chickenpox, for example, who don't want to give their kids the chickenpox virus. But at the same time, guys, let's not bring back polio, huh? Let's not bring back measles.
Yeah, well, again, part of the extreme reactions to that kind of thing does come from not seeing the fact that everything really is a whole lot. Mm-hmm. And so any individual has rights, but those are set in the context of the responsibilities that they have mm-hmm. to the larger collective whole that they're members of. And both of these are important, and you can't have one without the other. And then, of course, you have to actually decide, you know, just what these are. But part of the whole Declaration of Independence that you were mentioning is that it was describing rights to individuals as wholes mm-hmm. in a way that hadn't been done before. And you were the subject of the king, which often meant property. I mean, it was a serious issue. Mm-hmm. But there are rights that individuals have in society, and they do have responsibilities that they have to take into account. So you can even look at something like, let's say, most states have helmet laws for motorcycle riders. And there's a simple reason for that. In Colorado, the amount of medical care due to injuries from people not wearing helmets on motorcycles was well over $6 million a year. So it's not just your right. Since we have to pay for your thing, then we have a say on whether we're going to pay that money or not. Maybe we choose not to. Most states have chosen they don't want to do that. So motorcycle helmets are mandatory in most states. And that's just an example about how wholes and parts fit together, and you have to come up with some sort of solution to those things. Vaccines, I think some sort of balance, one of the things that you're talking about, that if you choose not to vaccinate your child, then that's fine, but not for public school. You can elsewhere. One of the things you would certainly want to do is come up with lists of vaccines for which there's very little evidence that they do that kind of damage, and which generally don't get a lot of attention. Most people don't mind them. And those can just go on a generally mandatory list. And then you take this small handful that people have questions about, and those can be looked at with different ways. And different responsibilities can be put on those. And those could include, okay, you can opt out of these, but then that's going to limit the types of public that you can associate with. And I think that's entirely reasonable, because again, any right that a hold-on has is because of some responsibility that's being taken somewhere.
Yep. Every right comes with a social contract.
Always. And so that doesn't mean we can't, jiggle them and alter them and come up with compromise and all of that. But it certainly means that they come together, and we always have to keep those things in mind. And vaccines is a classic example of something like that.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Ken.
Yeah.
All right, next question.
Yeah.
Should the United States enact compulsory voting like they do in Australia? It's funny, all of these questions, Ken, are coming down to what are we going to allow the state to make mandatory, and what are we not going to allow the state to make mandatory? What is left to sort of individual responsibility and self-reliance, and where do we really doubt individuals' capacity to be a rational agent?
It all comes down to whole-ons as wholes and parts.
Yep.
And the rights that they have and the responsibilities that they have.
Yep.
And that's one of the reasons that we have those. And so it's a serious issue. And if you look at the quadrants, it's also a matter of how do you integrate the upper quadrants, which tend to be the individual, which would mean an autonomous whole on its own, and then the lower quadrants that are wholes as members of larger collectives. Mm-hmm. And so how do you get those two together? Then you also have to integrate the left and the right. And that's why I would point out how in some ways the political orientations of left and right are ones that focus on those, and which one of those are the main cause of problems. And the answer is both of them. You have to include both of them, and you certainly need to take them into account. That goes for upper and lower as well. In terms of a forced voting, I have it kind of as part of sort of a branch point logic. In other words, if you don't do these things, then this is more necessary. If you don't do this, then this is more necessary. And at the bottom is compulsory voting, like Australia. But one of the things that I would put before that, I mean, the whole point about something like voting, that's a deeply intentional left-hand component for a person. If you're not just doing it mechanically, you have no idea who they are, you just maybe vote according to party, or you just go in and close your eyes and pull a bar. The whole point about voting is that it is reaffirming and engaging that part of your intentionality that connects with the collective that you're a part of. And one of the ways that we found historically that you get upper and lower together, that you get an individual to work together in a group is, and what that means is the individual has to curtail their behavior in some ways in order to fit into the group. And what we found repeatedly is that people are more willing to do that if they have some say in the laws that are governing how they'll restrict their behavior. And if they do have a say in that, then they're more willing to go along with them, even if they don't like what they are, if they participated in the overall process. And that, of course, is one of the things that democracy attempts to work with.
As we saw in your classroom example earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the few ways that really seems to work. And so what we want from voting is this genuine, intentional drive for people to be connecting with this larger, wherever they're voting, locally, state, federally. The best way, I think, or certainly a better way to generate that type of intent to connect with a national identity is through the national service period, where that's supposed to actually help grow that intentional drive. And then that would be, somebody doing that would be more likely to exercise that intent by voting. And that would be my preference. If we don't have that, and then again, given the extreme polarization that we're seeing in this culture, then having something like Australia's version of voting is certainly something that I think should be considered. We do have, there are a lot of sub-fights involved in that, including at least some people in some parties that attempt to fix voting so it's harder to do for some people. And they're not going to like mandatory voting because it's going to let those people get access to those votes. So that'll be a political battle that will have to be fought, and a political battle worth losing on that side. So there are issues, but yeah, my preference would be a national service. And then if not, it's something like this is certainly worth considering.
Yeah, Ken, I love this. I was going to go the exact same direction with that, which is if we actually did create a mandatory national service, I think a lot of this issue would resolve itself.
Right.
Assuming we don't get that, I personally am not into the idea of forced voting, only because I think that abstaining from speech is a form of free speech. So not voting is in itself a political decision. Now, I personally think it's a really stupid political decision, but it is still a political decision that I think people have the right to make if that's how they want to roll. That said, I do think that it seems clear to me anyway, voting should be made as easy and frictionless as possible. I'm into having a national holiday on election day. I'm into early voting, mail-in voting. I'm definitely into restoring voting rights for felons, as we did in Florida. I think that if you've served your time, you should have all of your rights reinstated, and you should have a voice in determining the exact types of laws that you were so affected by yourself. And I'm even open to the idea of certain tax benefits being made, not just for voting, but just for civic action in general, bringing in maybe community service and volunteering and all that stuff. I think there should be probably tax incentives for that. All that said, I'm not necessarily into forced voting, not to mention the fact that, Ken, as you and I have talked about in the past, all things being equal, sometimes the idea of one person, one vote is disastrous, because if it's true, as you say, that 70% of the world are fucking Nazis, yeah. we're just allowed. Now, that said, we already have this problem, right? Because we have a system, the Electoral College, which is actually giving more weight to agrarian regions in the country. And therefore, we're giving more weight to amber in the heartland than we are to orange, green, and let's say even teal in the cities and in right. the coasts. So, this is another one of those things. Well, if we got rid of the Electoral College, which, by the way, Colorado just voted to do, we're no longer going to do Electoral College. Colorado is going to vote for whoever wins the popular vote. And we're seeing a lot of other states kind of follow suit. I think that changes the game a little bit. And then we can have a different kind of conversation about, do we really want one person, one vote? Or do we want, you've mentioned before the idea of assigning weight to your vote based on the number of perspectives that you're fluent with, which I think comes with its own challenges. I don't know who the governing body is going to be for that, but that's another step towards utopia in a certain kind of sense. But as of right now, I certainly think that voting is such a fundamental right to Americans. I hate seeing these stories of voter rolls being purged.
Right.
All these made up stories about illegal immigrants voting. It doesn't happen, people. Most voter fraud when it comes to that is actually being done by legal voters, not by illegal voters. I mean, it's an issue that is ripe with disinformation.
Yeah.
And
by the way, I don't really like just in general the idea of compulsory voting doesn't set well with me, and that's why I put it on a branch tree with national service. And by the way, even if we did have it, I do think that people have a right not to vote, and the way that would be handled is one way or another, you would hook up to the voting service and you would actually enter your choice. I choose not to vote. I think it would be important to track that, just so we can tell how many people are choosing to opt out of the system. That's an important piece of information.
Totally.
So we would want to do that. And we were going to mention the prisoners because it was part of the discussion under the whole, what should we buy, what should we pay for? that's certainly an area where, because money is involved and wherever profit's involved, corruption is involved. And we also have another notion. We're coming back to whether prisons focus on punishment or rehabilitation. And there's some interesting information on that. But in terms of the single best thing that could be done for prisoners today is conditions in prisons are absolutely atrocious, and they're horrifying, and they're criminal. And one of the the amount of male rape in prison is staggering. Yeah. There are more men raped in America than there are women raped in America. You want to talk about a rape culture? Go to your local prison, and you'll see it really happening. And one of the best things that can happen there is when prisoners themselves, and this would have to be fixed up very carefully and with several sort of checks and balances, but for them to actually be able to sue, so to speak, bring a lawsuit against guards that allow criminal action and administrators in prisons, that would be one of the best things we could do to increase their well-being. Because right now it's brutal.
Yeah, it's such an important
thing done.
Yeah. Last month we talked about, toxic masculinity. Is it real? I think the simplest answer to that question is go visit a federal prison. That's
the collection of the relatively moderate number of males who have toxic masculinity.
Yep. That's where a lot of men end up, precisely because of that toxicity.
That's correct.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Ken. Okay. So, free speech. Talking about free speech.
Yeah.
When it comes to voting, so let's talk about it in terms of hate speech. Does hate speech make sense as a classification? Should government legislate to protect certain groups from hate speech? And I'll say, Ken, the only thing I really like about that I appreciate about the concept of hate speech is it allows us to better measure the motivation for a lot of crimes in a way that wasn't exactly clear before we enacted hate speech laws. At the end of the day, an offense is an offense. If you kill someone, you killed someone. That's the problem, is that you killed someone. Sort of your intent is secondary, but I do appreciate having a little bit more granularity when it comes to being able to ask questions. Why are we killing each other? Well, this gives us a bit of a better answer.
Yeah, well, I think people have a natural, people at particular stages of development have an inclination to get particularly upset about hate speech. The Supreme Court has already denied that it's a category. I mean, that's been decided. And the question is, if you see it as falling under a free speech rubric, then I don't think there's any question but that hate speech as a form of speech is protected by free speech. Mm-hmm. And again, I mean, the whole point about free speech is it's not to protect those things that you're comfortable with. It's to protect those things you despise. That's why it's there as a law. It's the worst thing you can think of is protected. That's why it's protected. It's because it's the worst thing you can think of. And so, on the other hand, because we tend to do this anyway, largely due to the green leading edge, and this is a healthy part of it, although it easily goes extreme. But it's looking at things like motivation for something like killing a gay person because they're gay, as long as it's also applies to killing a white person because they're white,
Yep.
or killing a black person because they're black, or killing lesbian because they're lesbian. And we tend to think that way. And I don't mind having laws that are worded in that way, because then it just becomes part of the motivation and is in a sense dissociated from free speech as an issue of free speech. Because I do think, and again, what the Supreme Court said, it's basically the only speech that's disallowed and that isn't protected by free speech is speech that incites violence.
Okay.
And of course, that makes sense. But otherwise, I think the whole point of free speech, and the whole point, it's part of the Bill of Rights. One of the whole point reasons for making it a right is that think of the worst possible thing you can think of. That's what's protected. That's why it's there. They wouldn't put it there if it was, am I allowed to say I love mom and apple pie? Hey, we need a free speech thing to make sure you can say that one.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not what they were doing. And that's not why it's there. And this is the hard part of it. I mean, this is exactly part of the culture war issues. This is what put Jordan Peterson on the map. Mm-hmm. And the Canadian Bill C-16 looked like it was doing it out of compassion and out of care, but it was in fact violating free speech in that particular area. It was also instituting an absolutely horrid version of psychological growth and development, which is that you can just constructivism in the worst sense, which I can construct anything I want, and that's what's going to be real. I happen to think transgender people have very, very real issues that are actually happening, and they do deserve to be treated as a legitimate minority. And that's because that's how they feel in their own upper left. Right. It's also true in their upper right that they have an XY or an XX chromosome, and that's not going to change. Yep. So unfortunately, these arguments pick on just one or the other. And they say, well, they either are XX or XY, that ends the story, or they focus on the upper left. Go, no, they can be whatever they want to be. Well, they're both right.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. And also, what's your definition of hate? So I can say pretty easily when I'm talking to you right now, Ken, I fucking hate Nazis, man.
Right.
Right. There's nothing controversial about that. I hate a minority. I hate a minority of people who happen to identify as Nazis. Nothing controversial about that whatsoever. At the same time, I go out into public and something I would never say, I would never even feel an urge to say, but if I said out loud on a soapbox, I hate, the N-words.
Right.
That my freedom of speech does not make me free of consequence.
No,
right?
Absolutely not. And it's funny too, because the only people, one of the things that the radical left does a lot, of course, is people that disagree with it, they're called racist or sexist or homophobes or transphobes or Islamophobes or whatever it is. And it's kind of funny because if you take somebody who's a real racist, I mean, an actual racist, somebody like a neo-Nazi or a member of the KKK or a white supremacist, and you look at them and you go, you're a racist. They'll go, yeah. What's the problem? Yeah, right. I'm proud of it. Really? Yeah. And if you have somebody who, thinks men are the greatest or something like that, and you say, well, you're a sexist, they'll go, yeah, that's my point. They're not the ones affected.
Yeah. But you get the shame goes over their heads.
They don't have it. Right. It's the people that are free of it that we're yelling at each other and say, don't do that. And you're going, this is the wrong crowd to be saying, don't do that.
Yep.
Talk to the crowd that really are racist or sexist or homophobic. So,
that's right. Yeah, well, and it's interesting too, Ken, because it, again, bringing technology into this, it gets even that much more complex because now these days we have a new term that's been floating around over the last year, which is deplatforming, right? And people say, well, deplatforming is an assault on my freedom of speech. Well, yes and no. So if you believe, for example, that the baker in Colorado had a right to not bake a cake, which is an expression of free speech, for a gay couple because he, he felt religiously or morally opposed to that. If you believe that is okay, then it's also okay for Facebook to deplatform speech that they don't agree with. And in fact, if someone showed up in the integral life community and started causing all sorts of issues, I would ban them in a second. I wouldn't care about their freedom of speech, because when it comes to, no, you're in our house right now. Freedom of speech means the government's not allowed to tell you what you can and can't say. But God damn it, when you're in my house, I can.
Absolutely. And that's one of the basic fundamental distinctions that we have in our rule of law, which is that those governmental restrictions apply only to those organizations that get government help. Yep. Or taxes or some sort of public money. And then you have to follow the rules that's publicly set. You can start a private club where you don't allow Jews, and that's not illegal. If you're getting taxpayer money and you're part of a public school and you're doing that, that's illegal. And that's part of the understandings that we have. And I don't think those should be infringed upon unless you can start to show that the group is intrinsically attempting to create violence.
Yep. So, yeah, well said. Okay, well, related to this issue of free speech is what I will, I guess, call just free expression. Yeah. So this question is about cultural appropriation. Right. Namely, do marginalized groups have the right to certain cultural memes, practices, or artifacts? Now, on its face, I think this is sort of a silly question. And at the same time, I see something important in here. So first off, I think most accusations of cultural appropriation are kind of bullshit. I think that, one of our defining characteristics actually as a nation is that we are a melting pot. There is an integration process that occurs in America that is a beautiful thing. And how much amazing art has come out of this. I consider you, Ken, in many ways, a quintessential American philosopher. You are a melting pot philosopher who is very much sort of aligned with that, sort of ethic. And I think that when it comes to things like cultural appropriation. I mean, look, I'm Gen X. My generation invented things like electronic music and hip hop and, these very, very exceptionally eclectic forms of art, which all rely in a certain sense on some form of cultural appropriation. I mean, rock and roll itself was an act of cultural appropriation because we had Black musicians who were not marketable. So we found a white dude named Elvis who the girls would go crazy over, who can do the exact same music, and boom, rock and roll is invented. So I think, a lot of this is kind of silly. At the same time, this issue always comes up. This is, we have sort of seasonal controversies in this country. So every Christmas, it's a war on Christmas and therefore a war on Christianity. At Halloween is when all the liberals get triggered because this is a war on culture, on uniqueness, on identity. And it always comes down to these damn Halloween costumes. Now, I think there's something, a sliver of something important in there where I do think it's just honestly distasteful to wear a Halloween costume that's like a stereotype, right? To wear like, a Native American feather and, like stupid stuff like that, which are really just these very crude stereotypes. And you're not doing it because you're celebrating the culture. You're doing it because you're sort of making fun of it or diminishing it in some sort of way. I think it's fine for us to bring a little bit of shame to stuff like that, just because, blackface. No, you probably shouldn't be putting shoe polish on your face, people. This really shouldn't be too controversial in 2019.
Right.
So, I get it when it comes to that stuff. But again, if we had taken cultural appropriation as seriously as a lot of extreme liberals want us to today, hip hop culture would never have been invented. And that's
it's sort of across the board. And again, with some minor exceptions. But the whole point of the direction that evolution is driving right now is towards a global village.
Yep.
And a global village means an enormous number of different tribes interacting, interweaving, being interwoven, brought together, intermixing. That's the whole point. So, I mean, if we were to say stop that, then even something like the international style of cooking, does that mean, okay, stop mixing Italian food with that Chinese food and that Ethiopian food? You have to keep them all separate. What's more, you can only eat food invented in your culture, or else you're culturally appropriating something.
I hope you're not British.
Yeah. Should we only read novels written by people in your culture? You can't read novels from somebody else's culture. You certainly can't try to borrow them or use any aspects or be influenced by them. That would be horrible. How about medical discoveries, right? Only your culture's medical discoveries get to be used. As soon as you use somebody else's, that's clearly cultural appropriation. And you need to stop doing that. They don't have any of that in mind. I mean, it's really ridiculous. The part happens with this whole notion is because of that intense group identity politics, again, which is healthy Greens' attempt to look at areas that were marginalized, get people to realize that, and then help bring those marginalized groups back into a world-centric umbrella, a world-centric embrace. But by latching onto it so strongly and so extremely, then all you are is groups. And as we said before, when you identify with just your group, just your tribe, then you're not learning how your tribe, what it has in common with other tribes, so you can actually be world-centric. You're only learning how it's different and how it should be separated and even treated differently. And so the more you do that, if that's what your whole worldview is about, then one of the things you don't want is those groups mixing with other groups. And particularly if one group initiates that, then that's cultural appropriation. That's stealing. And all that is virtue signaling by an extreme regressive left that's lost their fucking minds.
No, again, it's so funny. The people who get pissed off by shit like this, who get genuinely triggered, are not the people whose culture is being appropriated. It's usually white bystanders who just get outraged by this shit.
And the other thing, I mean, multiculturalism is we're supposed to bring other cultures in.
Yeah.
And that also only works one way. I mean, you never hear them say, what Ethiopia needs is a few more Welshmen. Right. Just get that down there and they'll be doing fine. No. So multiculturalism, it works for, by the way, the only culture in the history of the world that invented and agrees with multiculturalism is Western culture. And that's the one culture that's hated above all other cultures. That's not integral. That's a broken green, and it sucks. Yeah, sure. If you are blackface, if you're doing, I mean, things like that are just, first of all, they're obvious as hell when they're wrong. And by the way, even in itself, it's only happened in the last decade or two. Mm. Remember all these guys that are getting in trouble now today for doing blackface? Well, that was 20 years ago. And it wasn't that much of a problem then because we still hadn't, got really the sensitivity to marginalized groups the way we had.
Ken, I remember movies in the 1980s, like these dumb comedies where the entire premise was someone wearing blackface.
Totally. And so, I mean, that's something that we take into account, and that should be handled, again, not by law. I mean, you actually had on some of the campuses that had some of these Halloween protests, the students were told, if somebody upsets your feelings, call the cops. They're waiting. We've told them to be ready for this, and they're waiting for you to call them. So anybody hurts your feelings, let the cops know. That's exactly broken green. That is essence of Broken Green. What we should do with something like that is the same thing that we do with something like the N word. It should be met with shame. Don't do it. And that's the only reason that shame is a little bit of a problem, is that in the 1960s, we started creating a so-called therapeutic culture where nobody's supposed to be ashamed of anything that they've done. And any shame you have is just going to cause you to lower your self-esteem, and all of that's bad. So get rid of shame, get rid of all of those things, and just sort of move forward. So now when we're really supposed to use shame, we don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
So you say, oh, call the cops, right? Isn't that what you do when you have shame? No, you don't call the cops. You invoke shame. You'll feel it. Look around in there. It's an emotion you've got somewhere down there. Just bring that up and shame the person for doing it. I mean, Jesus, you figure out how to do it in chat rooms, you flame everybody, which is also a misapplication of shame, because we don't even know how to use shame in an appropriate dose. It's just nothing. How do I use it? Or it's nuclear.
Yep. That's right. That's right. And Ken, I think that also when it comes to things like art, when it comes to things like humor, I don't think these things are necessarily off the table. So, I'm thinking, for example, of how, so if a white person does blackface, not many people are going to go along. Not many people are going to look at that and be like, oh, well, that's fine, right? If there's something obviously offensive about that. And yet, I remember a Saturday Night Live sketch from like 40 years ago where Eddie Murphy wears white face, right? And he goes into a store and there's another black guy there. And as soon as the black guy left, the storekeeper looks at him and it goes, hey, that newspaper, you can just take that. And Eddie Murphy's like, what? It was hilarious. It was so freaking funny because you're subverting the trope and you're actually using it to punch up. You're not punching down.
Sure. Whoopi Goldberg's boyfriend, she was dating a white guy, well known by the name of Ted Danson, and they went to their a party for them, and he wore blackface, and she was fine with it. I mean, hell, it's her boyfriend, and she thinks it's great.
Right.
So it shows you just how that background social mores can shift, and that's fun. That's what shame is for. Shame is actually a large part of the social glue. And when we got rid of it in the 60s, that was part of the beginning of the retribalization of the culture, because we were losing important aspects of social glue that we really needed.
Yep. Beautiful. All right, well, let's move on. So I think we've already covered most of the prison question.
Right.
Rehabilitation versus...
And I did want to say, because you had a question about what the actual aim in prison should be, whether it just should be punishment or rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. There's a guy who is a fairly significant voice in the California prison system. And he just recently retired, but during his career, he wrote several articles and books on a fully aqua integral penal system. And he did not only historical books where he used the aqua system to actually give a historical unfolding of various penal systems where they were aiming at what they were attempting to do using an integral framework. But he also worked to get actual changes in the way penal systems in California were run. And he had a moderate amount of success, at least in certain of the institutions. His name is Tom Gehring, THOMGEHRING. Google him. It's good work. So I recommend that.
Awesome. And I just want to say, I think it's a testament to my own developmental prowess that I still giggle every time I hear the phrase penal system. I can't help it. All right, so final question, Ken. And there's a few moving parts here. So here's a question. Should the following things be legalized? And let's just take them one at a time. Prostitution.
Why don't you take them all?
Okay, sure. Prostitution, drugs, and I was hoping to save this one as a surprise at the end, but sex robots that look like children?
Yep. Well, take the sex side of the thing first. I mean, even something like pedophilia. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we seem to have learned over the last several decades is that a person's sexual orientation really does seem to be set more or less at birth. It does seem to be a very, very large genetic component. And if it's not 100%, it's something like 80%. And it was one of the realizations that the gay crowd had fairly early on, and that it wasn't really a lifestyle choice. Almost all gay men knew they were gay from as soon as they ever thought about it. Whether 5 years old or 6 years old or 7 years old, they knew that they were attracted to men. It wasn't a choice they had to make. It wasn't that they had a couple lousy run-ins with women and said, to heck with that, I'm switching. And that's why the standard Christian fundamentalist schools that are going to take young gay boys and reprogram them that they never work. And that's just a real issue. So if we combine that with the general direction that technology tends to drive, and that is to increase the possibilities for narcissistic engagement. Right now, we're already to a point, one of the reasons that narcissism continues to rise in this culture is that the amount of time it would have taken 30 years ago to find a large number of people that agreed with you in your political orientation and your thoughts on almost every specific social issue, it would have been decades. You'd have to travel all over and now it's about 2 clicks and you're right there. So your own immediate impulses are getting immediate gratification. And all technology does a lot of other good things, but one of the things it does is it reinforces narcissistic possibilities, and those get greater and greater and greater. When we get virtual reality, that's going to take another astronomical leap into being able to create environments that are just your own choosing in every way. And that's going to include capacities for sexual stimulation. It's not just going to be 2-dimensional watching a screen. It's going to be 3-dimensional. You're actually there. You'll be able to wear bodysuits to stimulate your skin the same way actual sex would. And you're going to be able to have any kind of sex you want.
Yep. And it already, just to mention, it already exists. They don't have the bodysuits or the tactile response, but you have the 3D fully immersive. It's like you're there with someone else. It's actually sort of unnerving.
Yep, and that's going to get more and more refined, more and more refined. If a person's a pedophile, they'll have pedophile sex. We can't stop that. That was the whole point. You can't outlaw technology. So it's not a matter on those issues about whether they should be allowed or not. They're coming, they're possible. Some of them are already here. There's nothing we can do about it. In certain ways, you can at least say, well, that'll keep them off the streets. Fair enough. And so we'll see how that goes. Prostitution, same thing. So those are just, they're on their way. And they're going to be very widespread. Already, just 2-dimensional pornography is the biggest selling item on the net, of course.
Oh, yeah. Sex, pornography in general pushes every major technological advance we have.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that's just a done deal. That's coming. It's not even much to say about that. Yeah. Drugs is an issue that it's difficult, but I can say just sort of generically, I think that outlawing almost any drug turns out to be bad. And again, as much for the unintended consequences as for the what actually happens. The first thing women did, bless their hearts, but when they got the vote, the first thing they did is vote alcohol out. Yeah. They voted prohibition in. Right. That created the mafia, and that brought, it's just nightmarish. And so now we've got that whole problem. It went through the whole marijuana, reefer madness, and all that did was create this huge black market, drive it underground. And it's the same with harder drugs. And so there are even pretty staunch conservatives that I think even Bill Buckley was just said, yeah, legalize all drugs, because trying to keep them illegal creates a staggeringly huge illegal black market. We can't govern the quality. We can't tax them, nothing. Go ahead, make them legal. We can watch quality. We can tax them. It'll be better. And on balance, if you just have to pick one answer, I think that's probably the best answer. I think the unintended consequences of trying to make those kinds of things illegal are just horrid, absolutely horrid. Really, really seriously bad issues. Whether we want to take any one set of those drugs and look at those differently and say, okay, wait a minute, maybe something like the closest thing to a one trial addiction drug that we know of is crack cocaine. And it's somewhere between try it once to try it 3 or 4 times and you're addicted. That might be the type of thing that would be in a class that's just so outrageous in terms of its effects that we wouldn't want to simply throw that open and make that available. And so we might want to have some separate considerations for those. But on balance, I think making drugs across the board legal and therefore monitoring them with a great deal of care, and then also taxing them. It would be an extraordinary stream of revenue. Use that to pay for universal health care.
That's right. Now, as we're seeing here in Colorado, so, we legalized marijuana a couple of years ago. As a result, so much money is flowing into our school system as a result. Ken, I am totally aligned with you. I think that it is, again, we talked earlier about sort of the conservative prohibitionist approach to these things. It's another example of direct causation. Oh, America has a drug problem. Okay, war on drugs, right? Which only in most ways exacerbated the problem. And what we ended up doing is we ended up making this a legal issue instead of what it should be, which is a healthcare and a mental health issue, right? So addiction the legal system is exactly the wrong institution to deal with things like addiction.
Yeah.
This is definitely a component of mental health and just healthcare in general. Yeah. It's kind of funny that when the Reagan administration launched the war on drugs, this was concurrent with shutting down all of the mental health care all over the country. So suddenly we have thousands of literal mental patients on the street who are, getting addicted and all this stuff in the midst of this sort of sanctimonious, moralistic war on drugs where, if you get high, that's a moral failing. Well, no, we have so many more decades now of research showing this has nothing to do with moral failing. This is 9 times out of 10, more often than not, this is a problem of either it's a class issue of poverty where literally there's nothing bringing me joy right now. So I'm just going to shoot this into my arm or roll up a joint or what have you. Or it's a mental illness problem or what have you. But this is the legal institution is very ill-equipped to deal with this problem. Now, that said, I think there's a spectrum. I think it's different to say, should marijuana be legalized? I think you and I both agree. Yeah, legalize weed. In fact, I'm kind of surprised it's taken you boomers this long to do it. as opposed to, you know, some of the stupid shit that's out there like PCP or you know, bath salts or, you know, shit like this, which is methamphetamine, which is kind of inevitable on the one hand, but you know, runs serious risk of destroying not only your life, but the lives of the people around you. So again, we run into this hierarchy. Okay, yeah, you have the right to pursue your happiness with drugs, but not when it runs against my liberty. You have the liberty to get high, but not when it puts other people's lives at risk. And that's where the legal system, I think, can step in. But until then, this really feels like a mental health issue more than anything else.
Yeah, and what we're facing also, which is just a whole nother long discussion in itself, so I'll just briefly point it out, but one of the core drives of people using drugs across the board is the desire to get high.
Yeah, totally.
And the desire to get high is also runs into that whole category that we call waking up.
Totally. Yep.
One of the most common ways that waking up is described is Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. This part, I mean, even people like Houston Smith would say, yeah, the heroin addict is getting his hit of God. I mean, you've got to take that into account. And that does have some role to play when we're talking about those kinds of things. And it's one of the reasons we'll never, ever, ever be able to get rid of anything that's going to help you get high. It's because we're never going to get rid of a human being's desire for waking up and the qualities that go with that. Yeah. And so that's another issue that needs to be at least addressed when we talk about this. The more we actually had waking up as part of our cultural practices, where people could actually do that and get some of those highs in ways other than medically catastrophic,
yeah,
that would be a good thing. So that's
such an awesome point, because it's true. We are literally, I mean, we are born with this hardwired. I mean, little kids spin themselves in a circle until they get dizzy and puke just to get the head change. I mean, this really is part of our DNA in a certain sense. And it's also, I think, testament to how suspicious we are culturally of altered states of non-sanctioned states of consciousness. Because you get a lot of, you know, non-conformist behavior that comes out of shit like that.
There's a whole issue that I generally just call the politics of consciousness. Yeah. And it's enormous, it's powerful, and it's been present in every culture we've ever had. Mm-hmm. Because human beings have been trying to get into altered states from the beginning. As you say, it's hardwired. It's part of our genetic disposition. And that's not going to go away. So we need to keep that in mind.
Yep, that's right. Well, Ken, this has been awesome, man. I can't believe we got through the list. There was so much here.
That's right.
This has been absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, as always, for your time, for your wisdom, for your grace. To everyone watching, be sure to join us next month. We're going to do the same thing, second Saturday of March. I don't have my calendar in front of me right now, so I have no idea what date that falls on. But please join us for the next episode of The Ken Show. In the meantime, I'm Corey DeVos. Ken Wilber, thank you again, man.
Bye-bye, buddy.
All right, guys. Bye.